Over the past few weeks, as I've been diligently scouring the internet, compiling research and assets for the upcoming videos on my channel, I've noticed a word come up a lot. Like, everywhere I look, this word is just all up in my face, wanting to get cozy with me, wanting to love me a little bit. It's basically just everywhere. And that word is Metroidbrainia. Not Vania, Brainia. I actually first came upon this term in the comment section of one of my own videos. My first video, in fact, which was about Animal Well. In that video, I mentioned that I wasn't sure how I'd actually classify Animal Well because it combined elements from so many different genres. But then a couple kind souls in the comments informed me that there was a new word on the streets. Metroidbrainia, that perfectly encapsulates what the game is doing. It's basically a Metroidvania, but it's one where gathering knowledge, solving puzzles, and unraveling mysteries is the focus, rather than combat and, blasting alien faces off. It was a genius word, it really struck me, and I was like, this is awesome. But as the past 2 months have gone on, this word has fallen out of my favor, so to speak. Because look, I love Metroid. Like, it's crazy how much I love Metroid. Oh my god, I love it, I just love it! And I know you love Metroid too. We all love Metroid. Who doesn't? But that doesn't mean that every good idea in gaming is somehow derivative of Metroid. If we're gonna name an entire genre of games after Metroid, and to a lesser extent Castlevania, we shouldn't do that unless it actually makes sense to do so. And as we'll see, with a lot of these so-called Metroidbrainias, it doesn't. I love all these games, and I do think we should come up with a new name for the genre they're pioneering, but I think the word we choose should reflect what the games actually are, and the intentions of their developers. In this video, I'm going to explain why I believe Metroidbrainia has become an overused term that misclassifies countless innovative games, a term that seeks only to corrupt our brains and our fucking souls. Quick preamble about where I stand before I start. Animal Well is a Metroidbrainia. Totally, I fully support that term when referring to Animal Well specifically. This is the only Metroidbrainia I've played, personally. I haven't played Rain World or Tunic yet, so I'm not qualified to say, but these may or may not be Metroidbrainias. Now, Outer Wilds, in my opinion, isn't a Metroidbrainia. Return of the Obra Dinn? Definitely not a Metroidbrainia. And The Witness? Not even close to a Metroidbrainia. In fact, I would go so far as to boldly assert that not only are none of these games Metroidbrainias, but it's sort of a disservice to them and their creative legacy to define them as such. I know we've all been having a great time with this word, but old Snulch is here to crash the party right now. Sorry guys. I guess the best place to start is to analyze the term morphologically. Obviously, it's a combination of 3 units of meaning: Metroid, the brain, and Castlevania. But as we all know, Metroid and Castlevania were already previously combined as Metroidvania, and then the brain came in and slithered its way in there. So to define what a Metroidbrainia is, we first have to define a Metroidvania, and then we can insert the brain. Now, I'll grant you, Metroidvania as a term was already a total slop show that wasn't always being used correctly and still isn't. The term originally described a game that was designed based on elements from both the Metroid series, from which Super Metroid is generally the quintessential inspiration, and the Castlevania series, from which Symphony of the Night is generally the prime inspiration. But the whole thing is kind of a kerfuffle because Symphony of the Night itself was heavily inspired by Super Metroid and mooched off of many of its ideas. Just like how in our time, From Software took the core game design of Zelda Breath of the Wild and combined it with their existing Dark Souls franchise to make Elden Ring, Konami took the game design of Super Metroid and merged it with their own Castlevania series to create Symphony of the Night. In that sense, Symphony is actually the original Metroidvania. It's also rad as hell, and if you haven't played it, what are you waiting for? The first thing you do in this game is jump over a drawbridge and immediately slash a wolf's face off, setting it on fire. That's rad as rad gets, man. It basically took the game design of Super Metroid, such as the large interconnected world where the player can explore and backtrack through areas in a different order, with a map that literally looks like this, finding upgrades and new abilities and keys to progress through new areas of the world, classic Metroid shit. But it also brought in a few ideas of its own, some of which were elements from previous Castlevania games, such as the enemies, the gothic theme, an RPG-style leveling system, melee weapons like swords and whips, dialogue and cutscenes, and of course the classic challenging combat and bosses that Castlevania was known for. It blended Castlevania with the Metroid formula, so critics started referring to Symphony of the Night as a Metroidvania. This name stuck, and now we use it for basically every indie game ever made till this day. But what's funny is, nowadays it doesn't always make sense because a lot of these so-called Metroidvanias that come out are really just inspired by Super Metroid, and most of them don't carry over any of the stuff introduced by Symphony of the Night. They're more like Metroid-likes or Metroid clones. We call them Metroidvanias because the name stuck, but for a lot of them there's not really any Vania in there. Just look at Axiom Verge. This game is a pure love letter to the Metroid franchise. It doesn't have any of the Castlevania influence. Not the gothic horror visuals, the RPG mechanics, melee combat, the castle that flips upside down. Aside from having dialogue, this game is basically just a Metroid-like. It's an homage, basically. Not to Castlevania, just Metroid. So why do we then call it a Metroidvania?
Don't even ask.
It would be more accurate to say that only the Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night, Dawn of Sorrow, and Portrait of Ruin are Metroidvanias, and the only indie games that should be classified as such are those that were directly inspired by this lineage, such as Blasphemous or Bloodstained. The rest of them are Metroid-likes, but we're in too deep now. We've already started calling everything a Metroidvania, so there's no turning back. Basically, that entire history lesson I just rambled on about was kind of pointless, because at the end of the day, this is all just to say that nowadays, we define a Metroidvania simply as any game that's designed like Super Metroid. That's it. That's all there is to it, folks. If it has that formula of exploring a large interconnected world, finding upgrades to access new areas, it's basically a Metroidvania. As I've mentioned, the word is a bit of a mess, and its true meaning is still debated, but I do like the way Kotaku defines it in this article when they say it pretty much boils down to non-linear platform games with ability-gated exploration. Or, you know, explore until you reach a point that requires a skill you've yet to pick up. I would add to this that a Metroidvania also has to be a 2D side-scroller. 3D games like Metroid Prime generally aren't considered Metroidvanias, but I will admit that that's definitely up for debate. With that established, what's a Metroidbrainia? Well, it's a Metroidvania, but with a twist, and this twist is essentially that the game takes emphasis away from combat and moves it to other elements that concern the brain. It still has that Super Metroid foundation, but the focus is on gathering knowledge, solving puzzles, unraveling the game's mysteries, or any combination of these things. Animal Well is the quintessential Metroidbrainia because that's exactly what it does. In terms of game design, it's basically a Metroid game. It's a deeply atmospheric side-scrolling adventure, where you start off without any abilities and have to start exploring. As you explore, you start to unveil the map, which is the classic Metroid-style grid map, and you find upgrades along the way that help you progress to the next area. On the surface, just looking at it, it looks like a good old Metroidvania, which is exactly what I thought the game would be before its release. But this game changes the rules a little bit because, like a puzzle or a mystery game, you have to solve puzzles and riddles and think carefully to unveil the game's hidden areas and secrets. This isn't so much a game you beat, as a game you solve piece by piece. It's a knowledge-based mystery puzzle game, but it plays like a Metroid game, which is probably why people started jokingly referring to it as a Metroidbrainia. At least, that's what I thought. But as it turns out, the word Metroidbrainia actually predates Animal Well by at least a couple of years. Even back in 2021, some gamers were already using this word to classify several knowledge-based games, such as Outer Wilds, Return of the Obra Dinn, and The Witness, and I do have a few issues with this. So, and without spoiling shit, because I wouldn't dream of it, this video is going to be spoiler-free, baby. Let's talk about some of these, and hopefully I can explain why I don't think we should call them Metroidbrainas. Starting, of course, with the great God King masterpiece itself, Outer Wilds. This game is an absolute poundhouse. It's a masterpiece. I can say that without a lick of hesitation. Basically, everyone who plays this game says the same two things. I've never played a game like that before, and that was one of the coolest games I've ever played. I won't spoil it, but basically it's a sci-fi exploration game focused on solving an ancient mystery in a solar system, and it takes a ridiculously unique approach to that concept. The game separates itself from other mystery games because the player's knowledge is given an insane amount of power in the game design. If you know the game's secrets, you can do things that new players simply could never do because they lack the knowledge. I do agree with the sentiment that for games that do this sort of thing, they need a new name. But Metroidbrainia is not the term I would use. Let's start with the obvious fact that unlike Animal Well, which was clearly inspired by Metroid, Outer Wilds isn't a Metroidvania at all. There are some similarities with Metroid Prime, like being set in outer space and reading ancient alien text with the scan visor, but those are sci-fi tropes and they don't make this a Metroidvania. In terms of game design, the developers cite a photography side quest in The Wind Waker as one of their main inspirations.
And it's cool, because you see a photo and you're like, wow, I wonder what this weird statue is, and he will like tell you where he took the photo, and so if you're curious, you can go check it out, but the game isn't telling you to do that. Outer Wilds in some ways was a response to Skyward Sword.
In fact, Zelda in general seems to have been the guiding force. If anything, the game design is most similar to Zelda Breath of the Wild. In both games, you're confined to a starting tutorial area, the Great Plateau in Zelda, Timberhearth in Outer Wilds, where you learn the basic controls and mechanics of the game before receiving some item that sets you loose into the world. From there, you can go wherever you want, just like the original Legend of Zelda, driven by your own curiosity to explore. But beyond that, the team carved out an entirely new and unique way to design their game, through a rigorous creative process, without ever standing on the shoulders of Metroid or Castlevania. The most notable difference is that the game isn't a side-scroller. As I mentioned, it is up for debate whether a game in this genre needs to be a side-scroller. Perhaps it isn't a requirement, but it definitely is a bit odd calling Outer Wilds a Metroidbrainia, because, well, this is a Metroidvania. This is Outer Wilds.
See the difference?
But okay, let's put that aside. You can still argue that if the game has the other elements of a Metroid game, like an interconnected world with backtracking, a map where you can mark areas you need to revisit, upgrades and power-ups that help you get further, a strong atmosphere, and encouraging exploration, it could still be called a Metroidvania, and then by extension a Metroidbrainia. But this isn't what Outer Wilds does. It simply isn't designed like a Metroidvania. There are no upgrades whatsoever to the character or to the ship. By extension of this, the game doesn't gate off any area of its world to you. From the very start, you can get in your ship and fly literally wherever you want without any obstacles or obstructions. Well, actually, there is one obstruction to certain rooms, which is knowledge. If you don't know certain things, there are rooms and areas that you can't quite access until you gain that knowledge. This is where the strongest rebuttal to what I'm saying comes in, that pieces of knowledge are the upgrades of this game, and that makes it a Metroidbrainia. Just like how in Metroid you can find an area but not pass it until you find the required upgrade, in Outer Wilds you can find a new area but not be able to access it until you've gained the required knowledge. In this way, getting these huge information bombs in Outer Wilds is the one-to-one equivalent of getting a new upgrade like the grapple hook in Super Metroid. I can totally see where this view is coming from, but on the other hand, I consider it a forced parallel and kind of a stretch. Finding upgrades that you can use to access a new area, or learning a bunch of stuff and then studying that information on a corkboard until you find out how to access a new area, well, those are just two completely different ways of progressing through a game. They're not the same and are only comparable if we really force them to fit into an umbrella term. Think about it, every game has progression, but that doesn't mean that they all trace back to Metroid and are somehow Metroidvania-esque. If I really wanted to, I could say that Fortnite is a Metroidvania. When you start a match, it has non-linear exploration. You can go in whichever direction you want. Then when you kill an enemy, you get all their stuff, which makes you way stronger going into the late game.
I won! Holy shit!
Exploring until you're powered up enough to haul ass in the late game is basically a microcosm of Metroid, right? So could I then say that Fortnite is perhaps a Metroid-inspired game? I mean, I could say that, there are parallels there, but I can also step back and recognize that these two games come from very different places. Watching those development interviews and seeing all the creativity and work that went into making this game so unique, I find it all a bit strange. When this game came out, I was obsessed with it, and I watched tons of interviews and videos and fan theories, and online, all everyone was talking about was how cool and unique and innovative the game was. What, only for us to all turn around now and say, well actually, it's more like Super Metroid meets Castlevania, but with a little bit of brain. Like what? Why? It was never intended to have any relationship with that approach to game design. The developers certainly weren't thinking so when they made it. So personally, I won't be calling this a Metroidbrainia, but I will concede that there is some room to suggest that the open world, the scan visor, space, it could be somewhat comparable to Metroid, but not really. Return of the Obra Dinn is an even weirder example. This game has absolutely nothing to do with Metroidvanias at all. In fact, it couldn't be more opposite. It was developed by Lucas Pope, who's basically a straight genius where every game he makes is just this completely ridiculous brainchild of his, usually encouraging players to think critically in small environments. Obra Dinn is one of my favorite games of all time. The premise, to put it very simply, is that an old ship called the Obra Dinn drifts into harbor off the coast of England, and its whole crew is either dead or missing. Your job as the chief inspector of the East India Company is to investigate the ship and find out how everyone died. It's such a unique and creative and frankly awesome concept for a mystery game, and its graphics are actually binary images inspired by old school video games and photo renders on early Macintosh computers. I'm going to be a little bit more hardline with this one and say that there's really no room anywhere to equate this game with Metroid. I can't think of any two games that are further apart on the spectrum, and I can't think of a worse term to describe this game than a Metroidbrainia. There's no backtracking, no upgrades or progression, no variety of different areas or biomes, no leveling up. It's neither a side-scroller nor graphically comparable to any game in the genre. Like, what could we even say here? It's a Metroidbrainia because it has non-linear exploration and the player can freely explore the map? Okay. What map? The ship? The ship is tiny, it's like a little ship. The whole game is on a ship. Any Metroidvania has to have a massive world that the player needs to explore. That's like a core part of the formula. Setting the entire game on one small ship is the magnetic opposite of everything a Metroidvania should be. And surely to be classified as a Metroidbrainia, it has to be a Metroidvania, right? At least to some degree, it has to have something to do with a Metroidvania, right? I don't know. Maybe there are some people out there who would watch this and say, Well, your entire argument is actually invalid. See, your analysis is predicated on the belief that a Metroidbrainia necessarily must be a Metroidvania as well, and that isn't necessarily the case. Of course it is! Of course it is! If the game isn't a Metroidvania, then why the would you call it a Metroidbrainia? That doesn't make any sense. If the Metroid part of the word isn't applicable, then why is it even in there? You can't just call something a thing that it isn't just because you like the sound of the word. That's utterly insane. I mean, you certainly can, but it makes you a fool, and then you spread that foolishness to everyone. I could look at a cat and call it, I don't know, fucking Beethoven's piano. I can call a cat a piano, I can call it a harp, I can call it a xylophone, but everyone knows that a cat isn't the same as a musical instrument. Likewise, a 2D adventure-driven Metroidvania isn't at all the same as a 3D murder mystery game. We're talking about two completely different things here. So why are you trying to take this and change its name to match with this? Why would you do such a thing? It's horse shit. Now, at this point you might be thinking, Snulch, whoa, Snulch, calm down, bud. There's no need to get all upset about this. It's just a word, just a bit of good fun. We need a new way to define these types of games, so let's use this. Let's use this. It's a nice word, there's no harm in it. It's just a word, just a bit of harmless fun. Well...
I disagree.
Because by attaching this term to all of these games, we're actually discrediting their creative spirit. Lucas Pope took the road less traveled here. He really created such a unique game inspired by the underappreciated Mac PC classics he grew up with. A game reminiscent of old sailor stories passed down from days gone by. So it's kind of scummy, don't you think, to take everything he's done and associate it with Metroid for no reason? He was trying to create a game inspired by old Macintosh adventure games, but now we're gonna remember it in relationship to Metroid? Why? I'd also ask you to consider this. Many indie devs or small studios who are making their first game will usually make a Metroidvania or a shooting game or something. And look, I'm not bashing them for doing that. If I made a game, I'd make a Metroidvania too. But the norm for new developers is to base their game on an established formula, since there are more resources out there on how to make it, and a higher chance that people will buy it. Now let's look again at Mobius Digital, the team behind Outer Wilds. These guys had the balls, the absolute balls, to try something different. They had the guts to invest their time and their effort and their money into a studio where their first game was really just flying off the seat of their pants and coming up with all these untested and daring ideas.
The joke we always make about Outer Wilds is it's the game you're not supposed to make. Because like, the way you do nice lighting in games is by static objects that don't move. Everything in Outer Wilds is always moving. The way you like make games is on a grid in Maya. Everything in Outer Wilds is on a sphere. Any like thing you expect out of game development, we just kind of had to throw away and figure it out.
Like, come on, man. We can't think of a better name for what these developers have achieved. We have to group it in with the pre-existing success of an unrelated genre that has literally nothing to do with their game and is already grossly mislabeled? I just can't get behind it, man. I've seen a lot of comments on YouTube say things like, I won't rest until Metroidbrainia is a thing, or guys, we have to make this word happen. And once upon a time I agreed. I was like, this word has to happen. But now that I see it spiraling out of control here, I don't know. What's that line from Jurassic Park again?
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Okay, a couple more quick ones here. The Witness, this one's pretty simple. It's a puzzle game. It's just a really damn good puzzle game. It does have that thing going on where based on your knowledge, if you know certain things, you can cheese the game, but it's really at its core a game where you're just gonna go through it and solve the puzzles. Its developer is Jonathan Blow, and this guy is a total jerk who doesn't even like Metroid, but he does know how to design a good puzzle game. His first major success was Braid, a puzzle platformer inspired by Mario Bros, and The Witness is inspired by Myst, which, for those who don't know somehow, is a super iconic point-and-click puzzle adventure game that came out in 1993. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years people start referring to Myst as a Metroidbrainia too. Oh god, please don't tell me that Myst was a Metroidbrainia all along. But yeah, The Witness is just a puzzle game, nothing to do with Metroid. If you're still not convinced, I actually found some footage of Jonathan Blow playing Animal Well, which is an actual Metroidbrainia. And guess what? He hates it! He couldn't stand it! He basically spent the entire stream just ripping the game apart and ranting about how poorly designed it was. Now unfortunately all those clips have been taken down, probably out of respect for Billy Basso who developed Animal Well. But by pure fluke, I was working on this video and actually nabbed some of that footage before it was wiped from the web. You just can't find this stuff anywhere else, folks, I'm telling you. This is the only source, the only place you're gonna get it. Here's Jonathan Blow playing Animal Well.
Alright. I can't do this anymore for now. Like, when you fall in the water and it puts you 17 rooms away, it's like, come on, guys.
So yeah, he was trashing the game pretty hard. He was being a bit rude here, but I think the reason why is simply that he doesn't like the Metroidvania formula. He can't stand the vagueness of not knowing where to go next, and he finds the constant backtracking tedious. So how does it make sense that we call his game, The Witness, a Metroidbrainia? Well, to put it simply, it doesn't. I don't think this guy's ever sat through a Metroidvania in his life. Although, I must say, something tells me that in a basement somewhere, Jonathan Blow is just sitting there on the floor fuming about how people are associating his game with Metroid, which he hates, for no reason. And I find that grimly satisfying. Dude is an amazing dev, don't get me wrong, but he can be a bit of a jackass sometimes. You don't just publicly trash another developer's work and get away with it, bud. I suppose there's some merit to be found even in humanity's mistakes. Now, as for Tunic, sadly I haven't played it, so I'm not qualified to analyze that game just yet. But looking at it, well, looks kinda familiar, I have to say. Yep, something about that looks pretty familiar to me. I think I've seen a thing like that before. It's Zelda. Zelda, bitch! Fucking love Zelda. But yeah, this game was inspired by Zelda. Yes, I understand it's a mystery game where your knowledge heavily comes into play, but it's inspired by Zelda. So, while it's too soon for me to say, I don't think I'll call this game a Metroidbrainia either. While I was watching videos on the topic to do research for my own video, I found this one by Tin Sensei. It's a really cool analysis of all these Metroidbrainias, spoiler-free too, I'd highly recommend it. He makes some really interesting points about how replayability is one of the biggest challenges of the Metroidbrainia genre. Whoa, or so it's called. I don't call it that, I'm not calling it that, that's just what he calls it in the video. Other people call it that, not me. Shit. In the video, you can really see the hoops we have to jump through to make this word work. Because Metroidbrainia is the worst word we could use to define a lot of these games, advocates of it really have to bust their mental chops to make sense of it at all. Just check out this moment where he talks about Tunic, Fez, and Animal Well.
Just like how Tunic is a Zelda game with a Metroidbrainia undercurrent, or Fez is a 2D platformer with a Metroidbrainia undercurrent, Animal Well is a front-loaded Metroidvania with a Metroidbrainia undercurrent. In fact, Animal Well leans far more heavily into the Vania than the Brainia.
Okay, wait, hold on a second. I feel like he did the best possible job a human being could do to make this word happen, but it still doesn't add up. If Tunic is a Zelda game with a Metroidbrainia undercurrent, but it's really only using the brain part of this and not Metroid or Castlevania, like where's the Metroid coming from here? Metroidbrainia is just an evil word trying to take over our minds, but I can't wrap my head around the breakdown. Here's how I would restructure this. Tunic is a Zelda game with a knowledge-based undercurrent. Fez is a 2D platformer with a knowledge-based undercurrent. And Animal Well is a Metroidvania with a knowledge-based undercurrent, and those two things combine to make it a Metroidbrainia, the only one on this list. Anyways, that's basically all I've got. I've played most of the games I see being referred to as Metroidbrainias, and so far the only one I've played that really actualizes this term correctly is Animal Well. Good job for that, Billy. So now this brings us all to the question, what should we call these games? Like I said, I do agree that we should classify them as a new thing. They are mystery adventure games, but I'd still categorize them one degree further because of their unique approach. As mentioned, the thing that separates these games from a traditional mystery adventure game is how heavily the player's knowledge comes into the game design. For example, my friend recommended me this game, Pentiment, which is a mystery adventure where you try to solve a series of murders in a German village. It's an incredible game, especially if you like narrative-heavy, text-driven adventures. It's a mystery basically. And like most more traditional mystery adventure games, if I were to start a new game knowing exactly who the killer is and what happened in this village, I would still have to play through the entire game. I could make different choices along the way, but I still have to go through the entire game again. Whereas with Outer Wilds, now that I know the mysteries and secrets of this solar system like the back of my hand, I can boot up the game and beat it in 5 minutes. Same with Obra. I know how everyone on the ship died, so I could speedrun the entire game in just a few minutes. I just have to punch in their names. I've seen a few suggestions from people on the web as to how we should redefine these games. In this Reddit post, somebody suggests calling them discovery games. Then this commenter argues that revelation games would be better. In the comments of Tin Sensei's video, there are also quite a few suggestions. This person thought Wilds-like would make more sense, given the fact that Outer Wilds is the bedrock game of this genre that will no doubt inspire countless others. I agree with the sentiment, but the problem here is the opposite problem of Metroidbrainia, which is that Wilds-like makes sense, but it sounds like utter dog shit. It just comes off the mouth wrong. Like the way the L goes to the D, then to an S, and then right back to another L, like Wilds-like, Wilds-like. It just doesn't flow, it sounds like shit, I'm sorry. And come to think of it, it also opens up the same problem of games being needlessly and illogically compared to others. Both The Witness and Obra predate Outer Wilds, so why would we call them Wilds-likes? I would think that the name we go with should have something to do with knowledge, the brain, and mystery. So, Metroidbrainia games. Let's go with that. Although I'm sure you guys can do better in the comments. Whoever comes up with the best one would be pretty cool. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and for those of you who are subscribed, an even bigger thank you for your support, and patience while it takes me like 2,000 years to make a video. I've got quite a few videos in the pipeline right now, so hopefully it won't take me as long to roll out my next one as it did this one. And yeah, cheers guys, peace! Woo!